Good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you might be, wherever you're logging in from. Welcome to this, the fifth of the 2024-2025 African Literature Association lecture series. My name is Simon Lewis, and I am sitting here in Charleston, South Carolina, in the US, on a beautiful spring morning. I currently have the honor to serve as the Vice President of the ALA, and I am the member of the ALA Executive Council who's charged with coordinating these lectures. I want to thank everybody who's been contributing to this series on the technical front, advertising, and contributing as lecturers and moderators and so on and so forth, since it was first inaugurated during COVID at the suggestion of then President Professor Girmay Nagash. If you have not attended one of these lectures live before, just want to take a minute or so to explain how it works. Our guest lecturer today, whom you can see on the screen, Professor Ainehi Edoro, is on Zoom with me. And our moderator, Professor Shola Adenekan, is along with our web whiz, Lexi Langendorf, while you are all watching via the ALA YouTube site. Please, for a start, go ahead and use the YouTube chat and let us know on that chat screen where you're logging in from. It's been really good in previous sessions that people have been able to access these lectures live from all over the world at the same time, which really confirms the value of this initiative and seems also to be particularly appropriate to the subject matter of today's lecture, because we're talking about the way that the digital can perhaps transcend the print medium. Professor Edoro today is joining us from Wisconsin, where it's still relatively early in the morning, although she's looking bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. And Professor Shola Adenekan is joining us from, actually not Kent, right? But you're actually joining us from Bremen, I think, at the moment, yes? So in Europe, where it's already early evening, he also is looking bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. He's obviously not been worn down by the length of the day so far. Another benefit of this format is that you can post your questions and comments whenever they occur to you during the lecture without interrupting the lecture. And we encourage you, please, to, as soon as something pops up into your head when Dr. Edoro is speaking, pop it into the chat, and then Lexi and I will monitor those things and feed the comments and suggestions to Professor Edoro and Professor Adenekan, and they can deal with them in the Q&A session once the lecture is done with. So those are the technical arrangements. Let me now very briefly introduce our moderator for today. Professor Shola Adenekan is currently an associate professor of African literature at the Faculty of Art and Philosophy, Ghent University in Belgium, where he is a key member of the Department of Language and Culture within the African Studies Group. Professor Adenekan came into academia only after building up an already impressive resume as a journalist, having worked as or contributed to such outlets as the BBC News Online, Christian Science Monitor, and the UK papers The Guardian and The Independent. Since that time as a journalist, he's built up an even more stellar scholarly record, having earned his PhD from the University of Birmingham in the UK in 2012, and having taught at universities in Europe and Africa, including in Accra, Amsterdam, Bayreuth, Bremen, and Leeds. At one point there, when I was reading that list, I was thinking he was trying to teach at universities in alphabetical order, and I was expecting him to be retiring from the University of Zomba or Zambia in 20 years' time or something. Anyway, but he's been all over the place and done incredible work. His scholarship on the relationship between African literature and digital media makes him the perfect moderator for today's lecture. His first book, African Literature in the Digital Age, Class and Sexual Politics in New Writing from Nigeria and Kenya, came out in 2021. It made the case that digital platforms provide ways for African writers to move beyond the restrictions of book publishing on the continent. Walking the Walk, not just talking the talk, that book is actually available as an open access ebook. In addition to his first book, Professor Adenekan has co-edited 2 special issues on African digital humanities. is currently working on a co-edited book on the digital in Africa, and is writing a second monograph on Yoruba print culture. And somehow, in the midst of all of that, he manages to find time to serve as the publishing editor of an online magazine, The New Black. And one final thing I'd like to mention, he's also on the editorial board of the US-based peer-reviewed journal Queer Studies in Media and Popular Culture, where he serves as the principal expert on African queer writing and culture. And I'm bringing that up in particular because I want to draw viewers' attention to the fact that the ALA's Executive Council last week at our EC meeting approved a new caucus for the association, which is going to be dedicated to queer studies in African literature. So that's a fairly significant new thing to report from the ALA. Anyway, thank you very much indeed, Professor Adenekan, for joining us this evening, in your case, and for introducing and moderating today's lecture. And I will now pass things over formally to you to introduce Dr. Edoro. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Welcome and enjoy the lecture.
Thank you, Simon. I'm flattered for that robust introduction. Welcome, everybody. Speaking from Brussels in Belgium, where I'm currently based. Our guest lecturer, our guest speaker today, is that special breed of scholar who bridges that link between literary journalism and literary studies. And when you look at our resume, it speaks to the current historical conjuncture, especially when we're talking about the digital age. It's a pleasure to be moderating this session with Professor Ainehi Edoro, who is a Nigerian academic of Esan descent. And she's an assistant professor jointly appointed in the English Department and African Cultural Studies Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She works on African literature and digital culture, and she's the founding publisher and editor of the very important digital publication breakthrough paper, a leading platform on African literary culture. I don't think you can talk about African literary culture, digital Africa, without consulting breakthrough papers. Her book, entitled Forest Imaginaries, How African Novels Think, is forthcoming and is to be published by Columbia University Press. Our work has appeared in many very important publications, including English Literary History and the MLA publication PMLA, The Guardian in the UK, Lit Up, and BBC World News. She's also an OK Africa Top 100 Women honoree for her work in literature and digital media. In this lecture, entitled The Algorithm versus the Archive, Why Social Media Won't Save African Literature, she's making us look at a world where social media platforms prioritize speed, virality, and endless scrolling, and asking the question, what are the possibilities for African literary knowledge making? What happens when literature deeply tied to history, culture, and the slow work of preserving knowledge collides with a digital world designed for speed, engagement, and constant updates? How can African literature stay feasible and exploit the creative possibility of a social media ecosystem while resisting erasure? And what does it mean to build archives in a digital world that thrives on impermanence? Professor Ainehi Edoro, over to you.
Thank you very much, Shola. I really appreciate your your introduction, and thank you so much for accepting the invitation to chair this session. It's so great to be here with everybody. Actually, let me just plug in my computer so that we don't have battery issues. It's such a delight to be with everybody, and I feel honored to be invited to give this talk today. Let me share my screen. Just give me a second. Okay. All right. So it's an honor to be given the invitation to present this lecture. Thanks to Lewis for the amazing work he does curating the space, and to the incredible team that he works with at ALA to cultivate this space. As somebody who works in the digital curation space, I know for a fact that it takes a ton of work to put these things together, and they are so generative. And speaking of archiving, it's this kind of spaces that allow us to keep a track and keep stock of those things that matter to us in our cultures and institutions. So again, thanks to everyone involved in cultivating the space. I'm going to talk about African literature and digital culture in a second. And I'm going to focus on an archive that we all care about, social media. We are all on social media, and we all have opinions about how this space functions. Many of us share content varying from professional to scholarly to very deeply personal things. So it's a space that we don't take for granted. But it's also a space that has had trouble kind of being integrated into literary discourse. And so part of what I want to do today is really, to be honest, not to give like a grand lecture, because lots of these ideas are still speculative in a way. There are still questions that I'm asking. So heads up, I'm going to probably have more questions than I have answers for. But again, that's why I love this space. I feel like it's, I've listened to other lectures, and I think that there's a kind of openness to experimentation and to just kind of exploring. And, it's going to be pretty relaxed. I have a set of slides. I honestly don't have all the sequences worked out. I did not get a chance to practice the lecture before I came in front of you. So we might have to kind of jump around a little bit, and things might seem a little chaotic. In the spirit of social media, it's okay. We are used to chaos and fragmentation, so that's fine. But I'm hoping that by the end of the lecture, we can kind of, end with a set of provocations that we can talk about. And I'm really hoping that this will be an opportunity for everyone in the audience to ask questions and really discuss. So based on what you have on the screen, I'm going to start with a scenario. And this is something that I have found helpful recently, is the importance of thinking, of having a certain type of future thinking when it comes to infrastructure and literature. As a literary scholar, I am trained to historicize, right? If you're a literary scholar, it gets ingrained in your head. Jamison's, popular statement, historicize, 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 right? We know how to do things like that. But sometimes something that I feel like maybe we don't do as much is forecasting, right? So what does it mean for us to look 60, 100 years in advance and say, what will literary knowledge look like? What will the literary scholar be? Okay. So I've picked this date, 2158, as sort of 200 years since Achebe's Things Fall Apart was published. And a literary scholar is doing her work, right? So imagine that, they are trying to piece together the African literary culture of our time, this futuristic literary scholar, and they are not so much they're not just interested in books, even though there are lots of books for them to look through. But what they are really after is the cultural life around the books, the voices, the conversations, the eruptions of exchanges, right? They want to understand what it felt like, what African literature felt like in 2024. What are they going to go for? What kinds of documents is going to constitute their archive? Will they go to Instagram, Twitter, WhatsApp, YouTube? What will they find? Will they be broken links, deleted accounts, or maybe nothing at all, right? I'm beginning this lecture with this scenario or provocation to say that the African literary knowledge context as we have it today is one that is fragmented, even though sometimes it doesn't feel that way. In the sense that as literary scholar, we have our nicely beautiful literary canons, right? And then we have this thing called social media that has a ton of writing in it, has stories in it, has people in it, has culture in it. But somehow we've not been able to figure out how to organically integrate it into the things that we do, right? And so what I'm going to do is to say, what will it take for us to be able to see social media as an archive that is worth our time, that is worth preserving? What kinds of conditions would we need in order for us to not think of social media as this disposable archive? And if it is the case that African literature now lives on social media, or at least if it's one of the major places where it is lived and being created, what are we doing to create some kind of collective proprietary archive around this very precious artifact that is being generated by African readers, African writers, everybody involved in the African literary project? That's essentially the kind of big questions I want to ask today. But before I begin, I want us to kind of have a clear idea what is at stake, right? Because again, as we are going to see, with creating an archive, it is about believing that something is worth preserving. In order for you to constitute an archive, you have to actually start by saying, okay, I want to save this, right? So before we even get there to say, is social media an archive to even start with? And is it an archive worth saving? I want us to kind of maybe just take a quick look at African literary context as it is today and say what is really at stake in this question of the archive. Okay. So you might have heard people say things like, oh, I did not start my timer. Okay. So you might hear people say things like there is currently a literary boom, right? That there's some type of African literary renaissance happening. And at times it's not clear whether it's actually a myth or whether there's actually a renaissance, whether there is something about this time that feels uniquely productive. So I just kind of want us to take a quick look at, the scene. So in terms of literary output, I would say that African literature today is doing a lot of interesting things. I'm just going to use this brief bar chart to give you a sense of what production is like in terms of numbers. So let's just talk about numbers, right? So if you see on the left, that is Heinemann, right? And Heinemann, I would say, is almost synonymous with 20th century African literary publishing, right? And so most of the texts that today we consider classics, lots of them pass through, the Heinemann corridor. Heinemann, at its height, was publishing an average of 10 books a year. 10 books per year, right? And Heinemann was a juggernaut. Think about it. Massive educational publisher that literally monopolized the African market, right? Masobe Books is an indie press based in Nigeria. This year, they are targeting 50 books. Next year, they are targeting even more. And they have this grand ambition of really scaling, right? Umkuki na Unyota. Sorry, I don't have the full name there. Is a Tanzanian-based publisher. They've been around since the 80s. They typically publish anywhere from 40 books a year, but they've hit 60 books a year, right? So if you compare the numbers in terms of output, these are just two independent presses on the continent, right? And then if we there's this South African press that publishes a catalog every year of the publishers on the continent. And this year, they recorded at least 60 plus active presses all over the continent, from Egypt to Mozambique to Senegal to Nigeria. These are independent presses. I'm not talking about massive educational presses. These presses are kind of more driven by market forces, and it's a sort of different ecosystem. And you'll notice that I've been mentioning Africa-based presses. I've not even mentioned the big five in the US. The US and UK continue to be the largest markets for African literature. I'm not even talking about how successful things are happening in the West. This is just continent-based, right? In addition to that, we are seeing other kind of ecosystemic growth, right? We are seeing things like the Bookstorm initiative that is training, since last year, began to train 16 Nigerian illustrators that were going to create children's books, okay? In the last month or so, we've had two major profiles from The Guardian and the New York Times on African publishing. At Brittle Paper, we take a kind of meticulous record of books published every year. And we try to be meticulous, but our means of collating books is very analog. So it is really honestly not even a representation of the scale. But each year we tend to record at least 300 books being published, right? This is just to give you a sense that we're talking about an industry that is viable, that is growing, that is scaling in a way that is ambitious and structurally, that makes sense structurally. And that there are also infrastructural things happening, like the Cassava Republic African Women's Editorial Workshop that is trying to train African agents, editors, publicists, because those are things that we are really lacking at the moment. Okay? That I say all of this to say that, look, this is what is at stake, right? And that this vibrant, thriving African literary space is sort of living its life on social media, which is why we really absolutely have to pay attention to social media and the kind of information that is there, and how we can establish a culture of care around social media content in relation to African literature. Now, as literary scholars, right, we are trained to think of books. I'm now shifting into talking about what is interesting about African literature on social media. As literary scholars, we are trained in terms of books and canons, right? We go to libraries, we pull up digitized books and articles, we cite peer review journals, we teach novels and films, whether it's cultural legitimacy. And when I say print, I mean the deep ideological bias in which we believe that anything that is worthy of being called literary knowledge has to come in bulk and in the form of blank pages cascading with inscriptions, right? This attachment to print artifacts defines what we see as knowledge, but it also defines what we see as worthy of preservation or as deserving of disposability. And today, because social media does not look like the types of documents that we work with, we tend to see it as something that is somewhere between a fascination, an annoyance, and just trash. But today, African literary life circulates through very different infrastructures. Instagram posts, WhatsApp voice notes, TikTok reels, tweets, Reddit threads, screenshots, memes. This body of content is not noise. It's not a distraction from real literature. They are the new documents through which literary culture is being created. Okay. And before I go on to kind of give you a sense of what African literature looks like on social media, I just want to give us a little primer on what distinguishes the social media content, which is why maybe as literary scholars, it seems kind of like a different universe of knowledge. Social media content, right, is they are not pages, they are not passages, they are not text in the traditional sense. It is a unit of content engineered for circulation, right? It is fragmented. Imagine an Instagram post or a tweet. It is frictionless, meaning that it is designed to be consumed quickly with minimal effort, right? So think about it. Social media is designed for, that part of our brain that does not like to work hard. We want the highest amount of pleasure for the least amount of work. And that's exactly what social media platforms are designed to exploit. Okay. And it's a single scan in the sense that for social media content, we need one glance. If you can't take it in one glance, then it's not working. Okay. One swipe, one scroll, right? It thrives on recency and virality, not depth or context, right? There is a reason why on TikTok, you don't even scroll, right? Why the swipe as a way of engaging content is almost magical, because all you do, you just tap on this screen and something new appears, all of them fragments that they are so easily chewable. And you can sit there, right? A Gallup poll in the US says that about 51% of American youths spend as much as 4 hours on social media daily. It's precisely because these platforms are designed to give us content in a way that is very consumable and easy. Most importantly, content on social media is binary. It's asking you for it's like a very binary protocol. You get to a TikTok video. All it's asking for you is, are you going to like it or are you not? Are you going to watch it or are you not? Are you going to scroll or are you not? There's just like binary demands from us, right? Versus reading a novel, where to read a novel is a different kind of economy of commitment, right? You have to sit there and read and think and contemplate. And even though you end up letting the novel go, the range of interaction you have with it sometimes can feel like it has more depth. On social media, there is little room for nuance, contradiction, or slowness. Often it is also decontextualized. A quote travels without the book, a photo without the event, a review without the full reading. But now this doesn't make social media trivial or meaningless. On the contrary, these objects are doing very important cultural work. They are defining what books get seen, what authors are interpreted, how authors are interpreted, and what kinds of discourses gain traction. The challenge is that they don't look like what we are used to preserving in the literary space. They are very different in terms of their scale, their rhythm, and instability has made them hard to value. But we need to understand them, not in order to dismiss them, but to ask, how do we preserve a literary culture that increasingly lives in fragments? Okay. So I'm going to take you in the next few minutes, I'm going to kind of take you into African literature on social media. I've given you kind of a sense of what the social media object is, right? I would say that that on social media, the life of a book is constituted by the content centered, created around it, right? So quotes, reviews, reels, reactions, reader selfies, debates, endorsements. In many ways, and this seems funny, right? The book is no longer the center of literary attention on social media. The book is simply a node in a web of circulating content. Book reviews, the traditional form of public literary judgment, have been taken over by book talk reels, reader videos, and digital reactions. In fact, social media is the place where you can talk about a book without reading it. You don't have to read a book, right? You can create powerful content around a book without reading, so that the book itself is becoming sort of an afterthought, almost like it's a prop for us to create content that people consume. So when I watch a 15 seconds TikTok book talk content around a book, right? The content by itself is interesting. The content by itself is complete. It is its own thing. It is not tethered to the book. It is own thing. So I could chew through hundreds of book talks, right? Without even being a reader, without necessarily having like a solid relationship to books, right? This is to say that social media content is almost like a literary knowledge or content that is existing adjacent to, but also kind of outside of the literary. Now, when I think about social media content in relationship to literature, I think about it in 3 different ways. One is what I just talked about, the kind of content created around the book. Okay, so Adichie's new book that came out on March 4. If you search the hashtag dream count on Instagram, it says 1,000 plus content already around this book. Now, 1,000 might seem small, right? Shakespeare, for instance, has like 3 million content on its hashtag. But so 1,000 might seem small, but remember that the book came out on March 4, right? And people have already begun to generate all this content around the book, right? That there is the book itself, and then there is this amazing visual cultural library that has been generated around the book that cannot be reduced to the book, but that is also in relationship to the book, right? And yes, it is Adichie, so we are not surprised, right? That everybody, that people are just are just jumping in and creating all kinds of content around the book. But ideally, hypothetically, every book on social media carries along with itself this collection of visual cultural archive around it. So that on social media, it's actually hard to see a book on its own as this isolated, pristine, artistic object, because the book is always sort of crowded by content, right? Which is both great. It is actually, I think, is very cool. But you could get a situation where the book actually can get crowded by the content being created around it. The second kind of literary content I see on social media is the para-literary content. And lots of people have talked about this. Shola, Adenekan, James Yeku. This idea of the world around, the kind of content, literary content around the book, right? So, for example, Présence Africaine, right, is like a historic magazine. They have this amazing Instagram account, and they generate all this content around the work that they do. Pretty Bookish is one of my favorite bookstagrammers. She's South African, based in London, a law student, and she creates this really beautiful space dedicated to African and Black diaspora literature. Ake Festival every year, curate all this content around the amazing work that they do with the festival. The hundreds of festivals on the continent, they all generate content around the literary scene and the culture, right? Now, this is my favorite archive, the Extra Literary Archive. It's an archive that is new. We've never had access to this type of literary archive before. Yes, we've always had access to author's biography, autobiography, Achebe's papers, Octavia Butler's papers, We've always had those kinds of personal documents that writers create, but not in this scale and not this intimate, right? And earlier on, when I started Brittle Paper, I didn't know what to do with this information, because it just felt like, writers were living on social media, but it didn't feel like it was directly related to literature itself. So for instance, Nnedi Okorafor's cats, she has 2 cats, Periwinkle Chukwu and Neptune. They have an Instagram account where they talk about her, they talk about their lives, and they also talk about this new book coming out called Space Cats. And Periwinkle Chukwu also has a Twitter account, which is like, you need to go to that account. It's very interesting, very strangely beautiful, okay? That's a picture of the Nigerian romance novelist, Bolu Babalola. She got engaged, I think maybe 3 weeks ago, and she shared it on Instagram, right? That is Alem Mabanku giving us a tutorial on how to make fufu, okay? That is right next to Bolu's picture is the Ghanaian romance fiction writer, Shelley Nobobi, who just went through a divorce and has been very open about, the kind of very difficult relationship that she was in. And this picture is her celebrating with her friends after the divorce went through. That is the Zimbabwean science fiction writer, Tendai Puchu. He runs the marathon every year, and we cover it. Anytime he runs, we do a news story about it, right? And of course, we're all familiar with Adichie's grief when her parents died, right? How she shared that very intimate experience of loss with the community. And of course, recently she was made a chief in her village. And then the last one here, which I'm going to move this for you to see, it's the Nigerian fantasy author Tomi Adeyemi. In addition to her Instagram account, she has a channel, and I just love and marvel at the intimate relationship she shares with her readers. First of all, if you just read the exchange there, beloveds, I want to send one of you a signed trilogy. Okay, so this is it's like a very deep friendship, right? And then she asks them, tell me your favorite memory with an animal. Okay, I will pick one winner from above, right? And then she says, love you all, happy full moon, right? Again, there's nothing like special about that. It's actually a very common relationship that authors on social media cultivate with their readers. This kind of deep, intimate relationship. Okay, so this has given us a sense of, look, this is what African literature looks like. This is what African literature looks like, okay, on social media. And I'm just focused on Instagram because it's very visual. But TikTok, Twitter, subreddits, Facebook, it's all over there. So now let's talk about what crisis, right? What does it mean to have this document and this content on social media? Okay, so we're going to start by looking at platform logic. Okay, now social media platforms actually appear as though they are archival, right? They store massive amounts of data, they offer search function, they simulate timelines. So you feel like, oh yeah, of course, Instagram is this archive that is collecting our documents. But in a way, is sort of is a bit of an illusion. These platforms are actually not designed to preserve documents. They are purely designed to optimize for engagement and to harvest data. And those are two things that are not necessarily equivalent to preserving an archive. They are kind of built around a structure of visibility, right? They focus on what goes viral, right? They value what goes viral. And what gets seen is what people interact with. And it's important to know that this is actually not a flaw on social media, right? The fact that social media is not really focused on preserving things. It is not focused on us developing a kind of archival relationship to content, right? All we do is swipe through, social media is designed in such a way that we have to work hard in order to see how things accumulate, right? It reminds me of a quote that the founder of TikTok said, Zhang Yiming. He said that, look, algorithms is all about bringing information, letting information find the user and not the user going out in search of information. So social media is really focused primarily on consumption, right? It gathers things, yes, right? But it's not with a view to preservation. And it's not even with a view to cultivate a culture of archiving. It just wants you to consume and wants you to swipe. And so this has real implications because unlike a library, which has policies, has funding, and most importantly, has a public vision, social media platforms are private companies whose priority shifts with quarterly earnings, whose decisions about preservation and access are opaque and profit-driven. Just give me a second to situate myself. Okay. So now I want us to talk about, to kind of think about the fragility of archives a little bit. And we're going to come back to social media platforms, why they are particularly fragile, right? Now, as some of you already know, right? The idea of archives that are precarious or fragile is not new to African literature, right? Oral traditions were devalued by colonial record keeping. Print archives are often underfunded and exported to the West. The story of how Tutuola's archive ended up in Texas is like a legend in itself. Even monumental magazines like, Pen Points, Black Orpheus, Transition, Drum. These are all magazines that were crucial to the 20th century literary modernity. They're all found in fragments and in northern institutions, right? So this quote here is taken from this brilliant study by Ashley Harris on metadata and small African magazines. And she built on the work by Uma and Krishnan. And really what they found is that these small magazines that were the bedrock of 20th century African literature actually are not as visible, right? They are not as accessible and discoverable, which is a problem in terms of kind of getting access to the context of emergence of 20th century African literature. Pen Point is one of the magazines that was decisive in terms of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's literary career. The University of Makerere has, I think, only 2 editions of that magazine. But today, right, it's not just a problem. This problem of archiving does not just apply to the 20th century context. So Kwani was launched in 2023 and discontinued publication in 2014. Kwani itself has had struggle having a fully accessible digital archive of its work. And we see similar problems shadowing publications like Chimurenga and Jalada, right? In the sense that you worry that their legacies may not outlive the websites that host them, right? Today, I think that given the way that African literature and literature generally is becoming so embedded and dependent on social media for knowledge creation, for visibility, right? We need to be more strategic about how we think of those documents being created and those knowledges being created on social media. Yes, social media is not an archive in the traditional sense in terms of being structured, curated, public, contextual, nor is it simply a void of disappearing data. It is an opaque, privatized, extractive archive one that we have no access to, that we don't control, and from which other people can profit. Okay? So think about it. When we talk about social media and African literature, for instance, we tend to extol the visibility that African literature has on social media. And as I've showed you, visibility is not a problem, right? The community is on social media. We are there, we are representing, we are creating content. But we should not forget that visibility is not the same thing as archiving. Abdulrazak Gurnah became a Nobel Prize winner in 2021. Before then, if you put Abdulrazak Gurnah's name on Instagram, 100 posts would come up. Do you know, we tracked how Gurnah's hashtag went from having just 100 posts to having 5,000 posts around his name, right? So we have that. We have all these people who have created content around him and his work, right? But there's no guarantee that in 5 years' time, we are going to have access to that, right? If Instagram wakes up tomorrow morning and says it's going to shut down, or it's now pursuing a different model where we don't have direct access to our content, right? Anything can happen. If Instagram disappeared, right, I will download my content, you will download your content, Adichie will download her content, right? But who will download the archive of African literature, right? Who keeps an eye on this massive collection of content created by individual users that amounts to the life of African literature on social media? I'm coming to the end here. All right. So I want to talk about how at Brittle Paper, right? How Brittle Paper is a case study, right? For one way that we can actually kind of create a space for rescuing. I want to think of it as rescue. And people who are Benjamin scholars, Walter Benjamin scholar would understand the power of that term, to rescue knowledge and information from places that are built in such a way that they see this content as disposable. Like, I don't trust Instagram, Facebook, Meta with all this African literary knowledge. So at Brittle Paper, we've become this space where we source for information, for news all over the internet and social media as well, right? And it has allowed us to create this archive of content. We have close to 7,000 articles that we have written since 2010 on African literature. And when I started Brittle Paper, I didn't think of Brittle Paper in those terms. I just thought of it as a space where I'm bringing visibility to African literature. Again, we focus so much on visibility that we don't give as much attention to the problems of archiving on the digital space. So for me, it was visibility. I wanted to make a space where African writers could be seen and the industry could be seen, stuff like that. And then over the years, though, I realized that this was not just a visibility project. This was an archival project, right? And so when I look back and I see our almost 7,000 articles, I look at it with gratitude, but I also look at it with fear, thinking, what if we didn't save all these moments? What if we didn't capture all these moments, right? They would be somewhere on the web, scattered, right? Without a space to kind of give it some type of legibility and coherence. I want to end by saying that that archiving has very little to do with nostalgia or the past. It is not necessarily a sentimental exercise, even though archives are emotionally powerful spaces. Archives are about building a future. And I love this quote from Derrida's Archive Fever. The question of the archive is not a question of the past. It is a question of the future, the question of a response, of a promise, and of a responsibility for tomorrow. That's why I started with that scenario, right? To say, how are we building archives that the scholars from 200 years' time is going to have something that has compounded for them to build on, right? To be honest, in a way, what I'm saying is not terribly radical, right? Archiving has always been about about intentionality, right? You have to want to save something. You have to invest in making it transmissible, searchable, usable. But my worry is that we don't yet see social media content, especially around African literature, as archivable. We haven't yet decided that this is an archive worth saving, right? We don't see it as part of the literary record. We treat it as something that is, generally disposable. I'm hoping that, we can kind of change that. And I don't have a solution for how this would work, right? But I know that we need a kind of communal ethos, that sees literary content on social media as worth saving. It doesn't have to be a centralized institution, but I think there has to be a kind of communal proprietary space, just like libraries. Libraries, I know, are not perfect. I'm not trying to romanticize the library, but what libraries have that we can learn from is this collectively owned document, right? That there is stewardship over. Right? Social media platforms is not that for us at all, right? We need to create a space where this amazing content being created on social media can be brought into some kind of collective proprietorship and stewardship. And I want to just end with the statement that archives is not what survived. The archive is what we choose to care for. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Edoro for your thought-provocative presentation. I think the ideas you espouse in your presentation speaks to me closely. I was just having this discussion with people about how do we preserve knowledge, literary productions, and the discussions around literary production in the digital age. And you touch on some very important points. I like the way you historicize and decide the current state of African book publishing and how that sits alongside digital storytelling. I like your discussion of this preoccupation with the book, why knowledge productions and archiving digital material is still not robustly engaged with. We are still not dealing with that. And I think this is due to what you also said, the assumed ephemerality and fragmentations of digital knowledge and digital production. You speak of the economy of commitment, first of all, the economy of multimedia aesthetics, the visual, the sound, the image. And you have very important questions. How do we preserve a literary culture that is predicated on fragmentations? And it makes me think about how authors and books are part of a network of capitalistic economy. I think that's one of the things you are talking about. That is also made up of the online public, the reading public, and various other cultural entities. That is not just based offline, but it's also based online. You show how the literary focus is no longer on the book and the author, but also on the author's private life beyond the world of literature. And this is quite important because it makes us ask the question, what is literature? And how is literature changing as well? And also the importance of looking at the digital life of the author. So not just the monumental occurrences, but the everyday engagement within the digital space. I think towards the end, you talk about how Instagram, other social media platforms are not designed for archiving, but on feasibility and virality. But the problem of literary materials, as you pointed to us, dates back to the print age. So it's not like, these materials also have feasibility in their time, but where are they now? And how did who is archiving them. So that's also speaks to the dynamic of global world power as well. You finish with that interesting case study of brittle paper, which is, I think, is very poignant because of the intention behind it. And the call for the new library, this collective library you mentioned, is equally, for me, it's very notable. We have some questions online, but I'm going to take the moderator's privilege. I'm going to aside the moderator license here. What happens when the digital publishers passes away? Like in the case of Kwani, when Biafanga Wainana died. Can you hear me? And what happened to the material that Biafanga was trying to archive at the time? What happened if something, nothing will happen to you? What happened if you as a publisher, you change course or something happened? What happened to those material that you have archived?
Right, that's part of the problem, right? It is what we saw happened to MTV.com, right? Which was a tragedy. I mean, when MTV.com shut down, right? There was a lot of conversation around the fact that a certain archive of hip hop music, right, is deposited there. These are writers who have been writing for like the past 2 decades about Black music. All of that, poof, in a night, right? And so sometimes we imagine that these archives are stable and that they are that they have longevity, especially on social media, where we think that, oh, it's always there. The internet never forgets. But the internet never forgetting has nothing to do with the intentional infrastructural work of archiving, right? And that's so, this kind of what key man problem, where once this person that runs a platform does not run it anymore, then it's done, it's gone, right? Those are all contexts that should allow us to say that, okay, maybe it is a different kind of communal collective approach to these spaces that says, even if say, let's say tomorrow Chimurenga's website is no longer functioning, there should be a space where we can, ask to get the information, right? To kind of to host the information in ways that makes sure that it is accessible for future generation. But again, right, we don't really see these archives as things that are perishable or savable, right? And so we have been struggling with the situation of losing somebody and then overnight, all the archive disappears.
Thank you. And we have questions coming in. The first questions, I think, is from Simon himself. Is there a role for the ALA itself in creating a digital archive? What would it take and how much work? How expensive? How feasible? What do you think?
Nigerians will say, see jump question. Simon, these are very serious questions. I mean, I can assure you that it's going to be very expensive. I can assure you that it's going to take a lot of work to do. I can assure you that it's probably something that does not yet exist yet. I don't think that that there are lots of people doing this work. I know that I think at Stanford or Harvard, there is a database of everything Mark Zuckerberg has ever said. Literally, a database that anything he has said online, whether it's on social media or on the internet, they have archived it so that we can go back and we can see. And it's actually a very informative and illuminating archive, and people have done work on it. So there have been examples of attempts to kind of rescue social media content or online content, but we need something more infrastructural. And I think the ALA absolutely, could be a big part of this, right? As an organization, really taking on that work of just even starting to ask the question, get people in the room and say, think about this. How can we begin to develop some kind of technology that allows us to index and document and save these things?
Thank you. And that's a question from YouTube from Carson. And Han is asking, what relationship do you see between social media platforms and cultural values?
I don't think I quite understand the question.
What do you envisage any kind of relationship at all between what we have on let's say Instagrams and the kind of African culture?
Okay.
Yeah. Or the kind of value judgment that we make on culture.
Okay. Okay. I mean, maybe I could speak on, say, literary cultural value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe
Okay. Yeah.
something
Yeah.
like that.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that, based on what I've seen so far, that that there is social media has kind of created a value in the public and the private being less distinct, right? And this is something, Shola, that you talk about in your book as well, right? That the public and the private has been less distinct domains. It has also created a kind of celebrity culture around literature. There has always been celebrities in literature, right? Oscar Wilde, for instance, I think was one of the pioneering celebrities in literary culture. So it's not as if that's a new thing, but social media has kind of made being that kind of practice of performance of celebrityness more pervasive, right? That's so where you are not just writing a book, you are kind of crafting this very curated persona around yourself and your book. And it becomes a context for the circulation of your work, right? So that I think I would say, is something that we now value that we probably maybe didn't value a while back, right? I wouldn't, for me to read Shoinka's book 50 years ago, I would not need to see him dance in a video, I would not need to know who his dog is, right? I know Alema Banku's dogs, like I know them, I would not need to know what he eats for breakfast. But somehow now, in order, the book and the author cannot exist in themselves, by themselves. They need something else to kind of push them and allow them to circulate within the system. And I don't know if that's a bad or a good thing. I try with social media not to be too quick to make these types of judgments, but to just understand what the process is. But I feel like that's sort of the space that we are in now.
Thank you. And I'm going to go back to what Simon's mentions and what which is the core, one of the core elements of your presentation, which how do we preserve digital materials or digital knowledge productions alongside what is being produced in the book format. I don't know whether you know of this queer blogger called Sokari Ekine.
Oh,
Sokari, yeah. Sokari has a blog called Black Looks. And that blog disappeared. And so recently I emailed Sokari and said, what happened to Black Looks? She said she had personal and family crisis. So she was dealing with those crises, and she forgot to pay her dues, you renew her dues for the blog. And what happened? The people who own Blogspot deleted or the archive, the material that is stored. I'm just thinking, do you think that regarding what ALA can do, maybe should that be like a session at the ALA conference where we can discuss maybe applying for funding to create a sort of infrastructure that you talk about and work with people like yourself who have the intention, who have the determination to do something about it? Do you think that is something that we might be able to explore at the LA conference level, maybe have a session on this? Not this year, it's too late, maybe next year. Just taking things forward. So that we're not just talking about it,
right,
and then we forgot about it, and then we move on. Maybe that's something we should consider even at the ASA as well, African Senior Conference as well, or any other platform? What do you think?
Oh, I'm always a fan of starting to talk, you know. My philosophy with creating impactful project is you start small. You start from you meet yourself where you are. Okay, so just begin, and if conversation is the way to start, I think we should start. I just want to to add to the story about Sokari's website. Adichie had a style blog, right? Chimamanda style blog before the Redemptions of Lagos, which was the blog tied to what's it called? To
The
America.
book, Americana,
right?
yeah.
Before the whole fashion thing that now happened with Instagram and with L.com, there was a whole time when she was being branded as this kind of like fashionista, right? Like a fashion icon. Before that, she had this blog, and the blog was pulled down. One of the few traces we have of that blog is a news story that Brittle Paper ran, taking screen captures from the blog and writing about it, right? So you're right that these things disappear. In fact, Akweke Emezi, you know that their house is called Shiny the God House. You know that their house had an Instagram account. And I just looked yesterday, it's gone. They've pulled it down, right? So again, you feel this sense of loss when these things disappear. And so, yes, I do think that there's a sense of urgency around this, and that an ALA session, a Zoom meeting of people who are interested is a place to start. It's of course a technological problem, it's a technological solution as well, right? Which is what, why it's going to be expensive. It's not simple, but I think even just having conversations about it, thinking about funding, talking about, people with the technical know-how, and just assessing like, what is our dream for this kind of project, and who should we begin to talk to in order to actually bring it about? And again, this is not happening in most places, right? American literature, people are not sitting down and saying, oh, let's try to, capture what's happening on Instagram. Because everybody just assumes that social media is going to be there forever, And then another thing that I kind of that also has me worried is that with the AI race going on, right? Because everybody, Meta, OpenAI, everybody's trying to be the leader in that space. We are beginning to see that proprietary content is gold. Like people like Meta, who has your Facebook posts, your Instagram posts, your WhatsApp messages. That's like gold, right? They are set to be leaders in the AI space. It's not about the models, it's about the data that you have. So just imagine us not having something like that. Imagine us not having a proprietary space where we own our digital content as a culture. I don't know, like that just seems kind of, not okay.
You're right. I totally agree with you. Before we continue with that, there's a comment here. I don't know whether that's a question or a comment from Pelumi Folagini with regard to there's a connection between cultural values and social media platform, quoting these platforms help us to produce and represent the cultural part of Africa, e.g. music. And then it continues, YouTube, Spotify, Apple. I don't know whether this is a question or it's a comment. I think it's mainly a comment. He said that he thinks you, Professor Edoro, is worried about the preserved part as opposed to present or circulating part. Do you have anything to say regarding that?
Oh, I think I'm interested. Yes, preservation is important. I mean, even that language to preserve, right? It's is something that we assume is already built into digital platforms. When I post things, they are preserved there. So when I do hashtag Mariamaba, oh yeah, all this content come up. So yes, they are stored and safe and okay there. I was at South by Southwest, a technology festival in Austin, and I got to attend a panel with Leila Lalami, the Moroccan American author. Her new book, The Hotel, is set in the future. It's a sci-fi novel, and the lead character is an archivist. And she said that many a times we believe in the durability of digital content. We just take it for granted, right? And we don't realize how fragile those documents are, especially when they are being created and circulated under the auspices of this really deeply profit-driven institutions. That so if it pays them to move, however, they will move. They're not going to say, oh, because African literature, has been created in this space. They will do whatever serves them. That's why we need to create some version of a library, like a community space where we can own and have a stewardship over our documentation.
Thank you. And then I think Gichinrigi Indirigiri says, let's begin talking about a more sustained position at LA 2026. I think both of us agree with that. So yes, we can start conversation offline after this, online after this. And then there's a question from Mariana Rothhart. Do open sources models like Blue say open source code provide more potential for archiving?
So, I mean, she's talking about Blue Sky.
Blue Sky, okay, Blue Sky,
yes.
okay.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, that's I find it interesting that she mentions Blue Sky. Blue Sky is definitely a different kind of social media model. They are trying to do things differently. But my sense is that because Blue Sky is, okay, think of Blue Sky like an email, right? So if you have a Google email, so I have a Google email, I can send you an email at your Yahoo email, right? We don't both have to be on Yahoo in order for us to talk, right? You can be on different servers or portals and you can still be speaking within the same context, right? So Blue Sky is trying to kind of cultivate this open space where people can really build their own social media experience, and is laudable. But I think that I am still always worried of being beholden to somebody else's technology, right? Because Blue Sky right now, they're kind of being touted in the tech space as, anti-billionaire social media, and they are doing interesting things with the whole algorithm problems, right? But again, I think we are going to be starting from square one, right? Because as we saw, Twitter went, somebody owns it today. You don't know who is going to own it in 50 years' time, to just not make us beholden to these spaces. We can continue to create content in them. We have to be visible on Instagram. We can continue to create content in these spaces, but create a space where we can also get those content out and have them saved and stored and taken care of and made accessible. I think having our own space is paramount for me in this.
Thank you. There's no question yet. Okay, so if there are no more questions, we're going to finish here. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your interesting and engaging presentation and conversation that ensued after that. For the robustness you brought into the argument or the discussions on archiving digital and even non-digital materials and the politics surrounding that. Thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I look forward to continue the conversation in one form or another in the coming months and so on. So thank you, Simon, for this for your time as well. So I'm going to sign off here. Thank you.
Thank you, Shola. I really appreciate chatting with you and talking. And yeah, more conversation in the future. And Simon, thank you for having us.
Thank you both very, very much indeed. And Ainehi, I need to read a couple of the comments that people made about the talk. One was describing it as brilliant. Another person described it as disruptive. Another is really interesting. And it was really fascinating. And I think it has put some great ideas in our heads. You know, what we can do as an association, maybe in connection with the ASA, to think about the way in which we can actually preserve some of this material, because that is, as you say, in 2158, that is going to be what the archivists will be looking back at. And thank you for picking 2158 and drawing our attention to Achebe, because today is actually the anniversary of the day that he died in 2013. So he's been on my mind a little bit this week. It was the week of the conference down here in Charleston in 2013 that he passed away, which is why it's so firmly etched in my memory. I don't remember everybody's day of death in the same way at all. But this was a fantastic talk. It was really, really interesting, and I know I am going to be making use of it in my whatever I present at ALA in Nairobi in June. So thank you very much for providing us with this amazing food for thought.
Okay, and wonderful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. We'll see you in Nairobi. Shola, are you coming to Nairobi?
I am. Yes, I am.
Okay.
Yes, I am.
All right.
Yes,
Oh, good. Okay, drinks on me.
Oh, thank you. I hold you to that.
I was going to say that's been recorded and will be preserved in the archive. So you better watch out.
Right. Cool. Take care, guys.
All right.
Bye.
Just before everybody signs off, I would like to say, remember, there's one more lecture to come in this series. It's going to be on April the 26th. It will be at the same time of day, and it will be also on the YouTube channel. And Carmela Garitano from Texas, who is going to be talking about humanities and energy and power and humanities. So that should be a really, really interesting ultimate talk in this amazing series. But again, thank you very much, Dr. Edoro and Dr. Adenekan. Really, really wonderful session today.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye, everyone.